University of Wisconsin-Madison, as well as an affiliate in the Morgridge Institute for Research. His work examines the social effects of emerging science and technology. Scheufele currently co-chairs the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine's Standing Committee on Advancing Science Communication and the Consensus Study Committee on the
put out a few things that we're struggling with as the as part of National Academies committees, where we're trying to figure out how can we build infrastructure around misinformation that is able to counter or even just chat with
on advancing science communication. Vilas Distinguished Achievement Professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, as well as an affiliate in the Morgridge Institute for Research. His work examines the social effects of emerging science and technology. Scheufele currently co-chairs the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine's Standing Committee on Advancing Science Communication and the Consensus Study Committee on addressing inaccurate and misleading information about biological threats. Dr. Scheufele's talk tonight is titled Misinformed About the Infodemic, Science's Ongoing Struggle with Misinformation. This talk will be followed by a Q&A session. Without further ado, I will turn the mic to our distinguished speaker, Dr. Dietram Scheufele.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And it's a real pleasure to be with you. I like that Zoom starts muting out applause the moment it starts, which there's probably some deeper meta meaning underlying that somewhere. But be that as it may, what I'm hoping to do is chat with you about a few ideas that have come out of the research that we, and by we I mean the students, grad students, and faculty here at Wisconsin have been doing over the past 2 years for sure, actually long before COVID started, but certainly informed by COVID. And I'm hoping if I look every so often to the left, it's to make sure that that I see what's popping up in the chat window, or if any hands go up. Also, if there are any audio problems, just throw them in the chat. I'm also really hoping for a conversation. So if there are things you want to push back while I talk, by all means, please do that. And just either unmute or jump in or somehow interrupt me. Be happy to chat throughout. I want to touch on basically 3 big points today, and the second one, as you can see, is a little bit or is the main part. But I do want to start with a premise, and I may be contradicting your speaker for the previous speaker a little bit, or at least offer a slightly different take on what the World Health Organization has called an infodemic, and maybe question a little bit our knee-jerk panic that came with that, and I will phrase that intentionally provocatively, and instead say, look, what we actually have is when we're dealing with misinformation, we actually have 3 larger systemic issues, underlying issues that are much harder to tackle, and that we haven't done as good a job at looking at. One is the fact that we are, not just for COVID, but for a lot of other scientific issues, dealing with science where sometimes the scientific facts are not as clear cut, especially when it comes to them informing policy choices as we think they are. And I want to talk about that a little bit more. We also have at the same time an information environment that changes under our feet while we're trying to work our way through these scientific issues, really tectonic changes in how we create, disseminate, amplify, exchange information, and some of that will be not surprising to you, but I want to push that a little bit further. And then, of course, the idea that when all of us, including everybody on this call and in the room here, look at facts, we look at them very differently depending on what our prior beliefs are, what our firmly held views are. And that creates a very interesting set of tribal ways of thinking about science that are novel and hard to navigate. And then I want to end on maybe a pessimistic note, that it's not going to get better or easier anytime soon. but hopefully also some optimistic notes about what we can actually do and what some of the steps are moving forward. But let me first start with a provocative take on the infodemic, and put out a few things that we're struggling with as the as part of National Academies committees, where we're trying to figure out how can we build infrastructure around misinformation that is able to counter or even disinformation that's spread intentionally. And I want to put out a few things that are important to keep in mind. Number one, there's very little evidence that what we're actually seeing or what we've seen throughout COVID in terms of misinformation, at least on the audience side, meaning are we more or less uninformed than we used to be in the past? There's very little evidence that suggests that we're less informed now or even more misinformed than we were in the past. A lot of the stuff that we're seeing during COVID, Bill Gates pushing viruses for personal gain or for population control have been around for decades. And if you look back at data that the Harvard Shorenstein Center collected, Tom Patterson there, 20 years ago in elections, 2/3 of the American public are unable on election day to accurately place presidential candidates relative to one another on issues as easy and as guessable, if that's a word, as gun control. So is there more information than there used to be, or are people more uninformed or misinformed? And the answer is there's very little evidence to suggest that that's true. More importantly, there's very little evidence, and in fact, there's a lot of evidence to the contrary, that if people were better informed, they would engage in some of the things that would like them to do, such as physical distancing or getting themselves or their children vaccinated. So the knowledge behavior link is actually at best a tenuous one. And very often there's very little evidence that knowledge translates at all into more pro-social or behavior that's in line with what public health experts would like to have us believe. And the Societal Experts Action Network of the National Academies has written a couple of expert statements on this during COVID. Nonetheless, what we've engaged in is kind of these corrective interventions where we're helping people who we think cannot tell accurate from inaccurate or even misleading information. So we're treating basically the symptom of an underlying illness. And of course, we've known and have figured out over the last decade or so that can have some real adverse consequences. There's lots of work on the backfire effect. And I would argue that that backfire effect don't occur nearly as often as some people think they do. And the research, I think, is somewhat mixed on how frequently they occur or how widespread they are. But even if they occur among some small groups in rare instances, and that has adverse effects, meaning people all of a sudden dig in even more and are even more convinced that their firmly held inaccurate beliefs are true, then it's actually worse than if we hadn't communicated at all. What we also saw starting in 2016 is that the more we engage in algorithmic news environments and legacy news environments with misinformation, the more we start amplifying it and actually giving it a much larger footprint than it in legacy media than it really deserves. This is just some data, and this may be too small, but you could, this is just a tally of how many hours total network television and cable television spent just talking about Donald Trump's tweets. So that nothing else, just putting tweets on the screen, and it adds up to hours and hours and hours and hours over the course of his presidency. So simply by engaging and correcting, they gave it much more footprint. And of course, that in online news environments is even worse, because the more we engage with misinformation, the more likely it is to get digital oxygen, as I would call it, meaning the more likely it is to show up higher on our Twitter timelines, in our Facebook timelines, the longer its half-life is, meaning it sticks around a lot longer on various lists and so on and so forth. So my whole point is treating the symptoms, meaning what we think is wrong, a pathology with the American public, because they're so much less informed than they used to be. We're putting Band-Aids on something that may be a much larger issue. And this is where I get to my second large point about these complexities. And I just want to highlight three of them. And during COVID, I think we saw that quite powerfully, the idea that the science that we use to correct misinformation sometimes, and that sometimes is probably an understatement, turned out to be wrong itself. And that created some huge issues in terms of us winning short-term battles over misinformation at the expense of a potential long-term war over science being a trusted curator of knowledge. And we saw it coming. This was not news to us. Adam Marcus and Ivan Oransky, who as some of you will know, run a website called Retraction Watch that tracks retractions in academic journal articles and basically quality criteria related to science, wrote a piece early on in the pandemic in Wired magazine where they said, look, we know science is going to go off the rails. We're going to do science under immense public scrutiny, very different from the way we normally do it, and at breakneck speeds, because we need to come up with vaccines, with treatments, with monoclonal antibodies, whatever else we ended up coming up with. And we will make mistakes, and we will make very visible mistakes. And as long as we know that some of the stuff we're going to produce is unreliable, we're going to be okay. But of course we didn't. And instead we produced a whole sequence of missteps that we're still paying for, both in terms of how we did the science and how the science was communicated. And the CDC, I think, very often takes the brunt of criticism, even though in many ways they were not the worst example. The CDC early on said, look, as the first research came up on mask wearing and its protective effects, both for people who carry the virus and for people who may be infected with it, as the research emerged, they said, well, maybe you should wear masks. And then they quickly realized people were buying up on Amazon every piece of PPE that was out there. And so they walked that back and said, well, why don't you start wearing cloth masks for pre-symptomatic or asymptomatic infections? That's actually really, really helpful. And so over time, they changed and adjusted to new realities. The problem is, of course, the argument was this is all about asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic spread. And then the WHO came out with this very unfortunate press release where they said, well, that's actually super rare. And all of us were sitting there saying, why are we wearing masks if this is so rare? What the WHO meant, and walked back, if you look at the dates, this was June 8th. On June 10th, they walked that back and said, hey, by the way, we didn't mean it was rare. We meant it's really hard to show in scientific studies, so you should still wear masks. But both science journalists, I think, and many members of the public were deeply confused. And the history is actually, Tony Fauci outlined this history really nicely in of all places, in Style magazine. And I put that there, A, because it's a really cool cover. I think there's going to be few CDC employees that are ever going to get a cover like this. But number two is because the summary that he put in there is actually really good of how they walked through as new evidence became available, how they adjusted their recommendations. But of course, for all of us who were watching this from the outside, we're reading the New York Times, and scientists are battling very publicly with one another, different schools of thought and different research labs or public health departments battling over studies on mask wearing, if they were right or wrong. And this is, I think, where we ended up when you look at some of the people that continue to be most opposed to mask wearing and other mitigation measures. This is Laura Ingraham, conservative commentator on Twitter, talking about a lot of these studies that ended up being either retracted or at least becoming engulfed in controversy, and saying next time they trust you, they ask you to trust the science, just remember all the crappy studies that they put in front of you to make that argument. And this is where I think, when I said earlier, we risk winning short-term battles, or we wanted to win short-term battles so much that we risked losing the long-term war. This is where we're potentially left ourselves unbelievably vulnerable as a scientific community. And as I said, the big catch-22 that we were faced, of course, with is the idea that we had to correct misinformation, or we thought we had to correct misinformation that we knew to be wrong, with science that we weren't quite certain would turn out to be right. And that left us in a really, really bad spot. And I just want to show you one example here. This is around AstraZeneca, which the European Commission, and for that matter, US agencies also declared safe. And the German Chancellor, still German Chancellor Angela Merkel, came out and said, yes, I'm going to get vaccinated, and actually did get vaccinated in the first round of AstraZeneca. And all of that happened within a week of Denmark, a country that's just a couple of countries north of Germany, saying we're never going to use AstraZeneca ever again. So again, thinking about the general idea of the public looking at this and saying, you know, am I informed or misinformed, and what information should I believe in? It was a really, really tricky and continues to be environment to navigate. Why? Because the policy choices that we pushed based on science and how reliable that science did not always co-vary to the degree that we would have wanted over time. So our first big challenge, and COVID will not be the only one and continues to not be the only one, is that we're using, and we have to use, uncertain science to make policy choices or to determine policy or regulatory policy, and that the foundation of those policy choices may change over time. All of that, I think, is exacerbated or is made even more complicated by the information environment that we live in. And I just want to give you a few, many of you know this, but I want to give you a few things to think about. The Economist's 1843 magazine had a great piece where they made the same argument that I made at the outset, saying fake news is not new, and it's a bad label in the first place, but misinformation is not new. Misinformation in news is not new, but the internet made it profitable again. And that was a very insightful, I thought, comment, because it both acknowledges the fact that it's not a new problem, but also the fact that we live in a media system that is significantly shifting its profit models away from for-pay journalism, subscription-based journalism with some advertising, to basically completely data-driven and user engagement-driven delivery of content. And I want to be a bit provocative here and saying, you know, we're basically creating delivery mechanisms that from the beginning have been designed to outperform human cognition. From the beginning, we're designed to outperform us, and now we're surprised that the computational capacities of DeepMind, of Alphabet, of Facebook, of Amazon do something that humans can't keep track of. Certainly the idea of deepfakes that many of you know, the idea that they're creating videos that are indistinguishable in their quality, fake videos from an original. We can make politicians say whatever we want, even in real time. The idea that we're shipping packages to distribution centers that are close to people that we know will purchase things because their social environment and their engagement with their social environment on social media are suggesting to us that they will purchase these things. And of course, the idea that when we see news articles that are in the Washington Post even, or the New York Times, these articles don't go online without A/B testing, meaning different headlines go online with that article. And within 15 minutes, the New York Times, the Washington Post knows which headline performed best, which lead performs best in terms of user engagement on Twitter, in terms of being shared, in terms of getting lots of engagement on social. And that is the headline that ends up going out, not the headline that an editor decides is really useful for us to work through a problem, but the headline that gets the most clicks and eyeballs. And as Facebook, Twitter, Google, TikTok, you can insert any emerging social platform in there. Emerged, all of their delivery, of course, is curated and narrowcast toward individuals based on terabytes of digital trace data and so on. Why am I mentioning this? Because it's all about tailoring information toward what we already believe rather than what we should know. And I would make the comparison again, somewhat provocatively, that you know, when IBM designed Big Blue, the idea was to create a machine that could beat a chess master. That was the idea. And nobody was surprised when it did, because that was the reason why we created it in the first place. But for Facebook and for Twitter and for TikTok and for Snapchat, for some reason, we seem to be surprised that individuals fall prey to the information that spreads on these platforms, That's what they were supposed to do. They were supposed to outperform us in debating. IBM's latest supercomputer designed to actually compete meaningfully in debate contexts. And of course, Facebook routinely doing studies where we try to figure out, or where they try to figure out how to manipulate users, even to the point where they themselves end up posting things on their timelines that they otherwise wouldn't have posted, with a very controversial study in PNAS in, I think, 2014 or whatever it was. So I can complain about this as much as I want, and I can sound like an old grumpy guy, which I am, fully embracing that, but this is not going to change. And for all of us who are on the old grumpy guy side, something that will make us even grumpier, data from the Reuters Internet Institute, where if you just look at the whatever that darkest red is, blackberry color, I don't know what the blueberry color, that's people 35 plus. So those are the old people. That's what I meant when I said it will make us even grumpier. And I would ask you to split this in the middle right here, and I hope you can see my mouse pointer, where on the right-hand side of that split, you have aggregators. So this is, Apple News, this is Feedly, this is where you can have different news sources that come together. You have news alerts, the New York Times, whatever else, the Washington Post, or you actually still go to websites and read articles on the New York Times website. So, and you can already see this is where the dominant color is the darkest red with the older group, and then everything to the left, Insta, Twitter, Facebook, and other types of social media apps. This is where the future is. So that people who basically go to the pull side of news and search news, that generation is literally going to die out at some point and will shift fully to algorithmically delivered news. We're not there yet, but economically, it's simply every sign is pointing in that direction, which means we will get more and more of what we already like, believe, hold dear, and we get less and less of what we don't. Because of course, the business model of everything to the left of this line, of this imaginary line here, is that it will maximize user engagement and will be largely agnostic to truth. If it's right or wrong is less important than if it keeps the user on the platform. And that's exactly how we got to where we are. All of that, of course, is supercharged, is put on steroids by our biases as humans. And again, I'm going to repeat something that some of you or many of you might know, but I want to maybe put a slightly different spotlight on it. And that's the idea of motivated reasoning in particular. As somebody who's still spent the majority of my formative political life in Germany, I didn't move to this country until I was 25. I have to say, and I'm saying this somewhat facetiously, but you guys definitely pull out the Hitler comparisons very, very quickly. And Bush was Hitler, Obama was Hitler, Trump was Hitler. And the fact that you can go out and actually put those signs up shows that neither of them was Hitler. But what it really shows is that, what Obamacare is for one person is fascism for another. What border security is for one person is fascism for another. And I'm not taking policy stances here. All I'm saying is the interesting thing becomes, and this is why motivated reasoning is so fascinating, because it doesn't say if I'm a liberal, I'm going to watch MSNBC, if I'm a conservative, I'm going to watch Fox News. So it's not selective exposure. What motivated reasoning says is, let's assume we all agree on a certain set of facts. We've all seen them, we've all heard them, we all agree that they're factually true. We will still engage in confirmation biases or disconfirmation biases, meaning we will weigh more heavily those facts that fit what we already believe. And we're going to discount and weigh less heavily those facts that don't fit our priors or what we already believe or what we hold dear or sacred. And ultimately what that means is, and the second part is often left out when people talk about motivated reasoning, that leads to biased assimilation, which means we assimilate new information into our existing belief systems. We make it fit somehow. What democratically, of course, we would hope for is that we adjust our belief systems based on new information, and we constantly have new beliefs and new convictions that change based on that. But instead what happens is we massage information so it ends up fitting what we already believe in, and we do that, of course, because it fits our our respective identities, and mask wearing continues to be one of those great examples. I live in Madison, Wisconsin, a hyper liberal place, and mask wearing, and I don't think there's lots of tie-dye masks, but what the Grateful Dead tie-dye mask is for the self-respecting liberal who buys organic apples in the supermarket is not wearing a mask to the conservative who's going to the football game. And basically says, look, mask wearing is just that's some panic by liberals who want to implement restrictive policies, and it's already not funny for COVID, but it's really problematic for science more broadly because it means the exact same science means different things to different people, and this is how we ended up in that tribal environment that we end up in, where a part of the country believes in climate change and a part of the country doesn't, where a part of the country thinks that COVID is really problematic and a public health threat, and maybe the greatest public health threat of our generation, and others believe that it's a hoax and overhyped. To just show you how that plays out in a policy environment, this is data that was collected by Axios on during the height of the initial wave, COVID wave, and where they basically asked, do you think that the official numbers that the US government reports on death rates is correct? And I just want to highlight two numbers here, and those are absolute majorities of Democrats and relative majorities of Republicans that are at opposite ends. So in other words, two-thirds of Democrats are convinced that the numbers that the numbers that the US government puts out are actually too low, that they're in reality much higher, and there's probably some argument that there's some truth to that. On the flip side, though, Republicans, 2 in 5, a relative majority, are convinced that those are actually exaggerated. One way or the other, we managed to maneuver ourselves into an environment where majorities in both parties are convinced that the official numbers from the US government are no longer true. That's how problematic the situation has become, that we find ourselves in, and the exact same facts meaning very different things, and in fact for both groups meaning that they're inconsistent with what the government is telling us. So what we were trying to do at some point, I spent a little bit of time at the Annenberg Public Policy Center, and while I was there, there was a fortuitous situation or what we thought was a fortuitous situation that we wanted to figure out, can we work around that phenomenon? And especially for climate change. And I promised too that I would at least have one climate change example in there. The Pope had just issued, before he came to the US, some of you will remember this, he came to New York, I think he went to the West Coast as well, Philadelphia, had issued this encyclical in which he basically said a few things. A, climate change is real, it's caused by humans, and number 3, we need to do something about it. So pretty much in line with the best available science, and the last part, some of the policy recommendations that we've seen surrounding climate change. So our hope was, here we have a conservative religious leader who's going to come in and is actually going to take out that cognitive dissonance that may keep conservatives from rejecting climate change, because he says it's totally fine to believe in climate change and be a conservative. So get that motivated reasoning, saying your priors are actually not inconsistent with the new information you're getting on climate change. So this is what Philly looked like. The whole town was shut down. This is actually the Pope driving by on another street, and you see everything from cops to everybody's downtown watching this. It brought people together who are Catholics and people like me who are definitely not, and everybody was basically paying attention to this. And our hopes were really this would produce some really interesting phenomena, or a phenomenon that would override motivated reasoning. So let me show you what happened. So you have on the x-axis down here, you have a scale from very liberal to very conservative. And on the y-axis, you have concern about climate change. And so you would assume, of course, that the more conservative you get, the less concern you have, and that's exactly what you see. But we broke the public into 2 different groups here. And one group is people who are unaware of the encyclical, so they hadn't actually read it or heard about it, the red group. And then the black group is the one who had heard about it, the black lines. So what am I showing you here? First, this is the red group. This is your normal differential. Not good, but we've seen it before. What's interesting, as people became more aware of the encyclical, the polarization actually increased, meaning liberals were more concerned about climate change, and conservatives, after having heard the Pope talk about it, became even less concerned about climate change. So the exact opposite of what we had hoped for, or what we had expected rather. And this is the explanation, exactly the same breakdown again, but this time papal credibility. So do they think that the Pope is a credible messenger? And you see the exact same patterns, that there's some differential on climate change. We asked a credible messenger on climate change, and some differential between liberals and conservatives. But more importantly, that becomes much more pronounced once they read the encyclical. So rather than adjusting our views on climate change, if they contradict our tribal identities, we end up adjusting our views on the Pope and saying, well, the Pope must be a communist. And that was kind of the storyline, or a socialist rather. Pope must be a socialist, so we don't have to trust the Pope. He's just not a credible messenger. So we can still stick with our priors, and all the new information about climate change being real that he put in the encyclical, we can simply ignore. So that's how, unfortunately, powerful motivated reasoning is, number one, and how hard it is to overcome, even with a credible messenger, with all acknowledgement that a Catholic is not a Catholic leader does not map really perfectly well on the US conservative landscape, and so on and so forth. But at the very least, you would have assumed that there would be some weak attenuation effect, but even that didn't happen. So that brings me to my last point, and hopefully I'm leaving enough time for discussion. I still keep looking over into the chat every so often. And I think, that we're going into a very interesting world when it comes to science and technology, and one that it's not new, it's not COVID related. COVID was just the latest iteration of it, but it's historically a third stage of how science has developed over time. And many of you will know this from the STS literature, that often maps science and three stages of science on two dimensions. One is how high the decision stakes is, meaning what happens when stuff goes off the rails, and what are the potential risks for society, and then how much uncertainty surrounds the investments and the applications that we're making and pushing for. And I put the steam engine here as an early example of what some have called applied science. Were the decision stakes high? Absolutely, especially as we're looking back on climate change and industrialization and all the impacts that it has had. But those played out over generations, and with at least time to roll back or steer some of them in directions. And the uncertainties, again, they were there, but they played out over a long period of time. So often that's referred to as applied science. Science comes up with particular insights that then are applied by society. That changed pretty dramatically at the very latest during World War II, when we had chemists and physicists, including Albert Einstein, writing to the US president, urging him to create the Manhattan Project, that of course created the technology that allowed the two bombs eventually to be dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Before that happened, the same group, or at least a number of the same scientists, wrote to the president again saying, please be very careful in terms of how you use the technology we've developed. So they had merged into, for all intents and purposes, consultants to the US government that were trying to influence investments and choices and policy decisions. This is where we're now. What some people have called, and I think very astutely, post-normal science. And I put a picture here of CRISPR, so new genome editing technologies that for many STEM scientists, of course, are clearly therapies. And I served on the Academy's consensus study committee on the future of human genome editing. Lots of people from the clinical and health side of things, and for all of them, this is of course an extremely exciting way of curing diseases, rare genetic diseases that we've just hadn't had any treatments for, enabling parents to have biological babies who in the past couldn't. But of course, you can already see all the questions that arise in terms of it. I mean, we've all read A Brave New World. We've seen examples of eugenics, certainly Nazi Germany and other countries. Designer babies as a concept looms large. And very often we respond to that saying, well, those are ethical questions. Well, they are ethical questions, but they're societal questions. There are questions about equity and access. Some of the first applications around CRISPR are applications to treat sickle cell disease, which of course is a disease that affects African Americans and people of Middle Eastern descent disproportionately. That's great, except for all of these treatments also cost $500,000. And if we're looking at populations, affected populations that very often don't have health insurance or preventive dental care, the idea of dangling a $500,000 therapy in front of them it is almost cruel. And of course, lots of other scientific issues since then have created some of the same set of questions where the decision stakes are unbelievably high if we get them wrong. And one could argue that social media fell into that, and where the uncertainties, if that's off-target effects for CRISPR, or others are equally high. For example, during COVID, we used the technology that we first started developing in the early 2000s after 9/11, when nanotechnology came along, where we tried to real-time monitor sewage and wastewater that came at the time out of a 4-story walk-up in New York City, in order to see if any people of Middle Eastern descent were hiding on the second floor in a sleeper cell. That was the idea back in the early 2000s. Well, in 2020 and 2021, we used this on college campuses to figure out if we can take sewage from dorms and identify pre-symptomatic infections, meaning the students don't know yet that they're infected, but of course their wastewater goes into the sewage. We test. The moment we see it, we go in and we test all the students. One scientist who was working on this actually went to the New York Times or spoke to the New York Times, and was quoted in the New York Times as saying, we'll do it the same way we did with Facebook. We're going to buy acceptance on college campuses, and then we're going to scale it up. Once there's acceptance on college campuses, then we can take it to the general population. Which is an interesting statement to ponder, and an even more interesting statement to make to the New York Times. But that shows kind of the disconnect between some of the things that we're developing and what's possible, and the awareness of what those may do societally. And of course, for COVID also, this is not data that you're supposed to be able to read. Simply if you look at the bluish hue and the orangish, you basically see rates during COVID in New York City of people who sheltered in place and worked from home, how quickly that happened and how early in the timeline it happened. And the blue group are people who are much higher in socioeconomic status and white collar jobs. And the orange group are lower in socioeconomic status and more blue collar jobs, meaning they weren't able to either socially distance or shelter in place. Or they were working jobs that didn't allow them to do that. So even the mitigation measures or adaptation measures, both in this case, that we put in place disproportionately affected different groups. So that brings me to my last slide, and that is in this world of post-normal science, we have very often kind of gone to this credo that we seem to be repeating, that policy should be determined by the best available science. And I'm going to push back on this a little bit. Science should not be determined by science. Policy, excuse me, should not be determined by science. In fact, policy very rarely is determined exclusively by science. We drive faster than we know we should. We know we could save thousands of lives if we lowered the speed limits on highways. We don't do it because there are different considerations that go into it. I also want to, when I drive from here to Milwaukee, I don't want to take 3 hours. We drink more than we know we should, and given the cancer rates that are connected to drinking alcohol, we routinely do have policies in place that are informed by science, but not determined by it. And actually, Tony Fauci spoke to this quite powerfully early in the Trump administration when he said, my job is not to tell them what policy to implement. My job is to tell them how science informs that policy. But that raises the question, how do we make sure that the best available, looping back to the idea of misinformation, best available science gets taken into account when we make these decisions? And I just want to highlight 4 things here really quickly that I think we're underappreciating. And this is, again, not a graph that I necessarily think you need to be able to read. I just wanted to flag it. It's a great study that was done out of Wharton, the business school at Penn, where you see on the x-axis ideology, and on the y-axis you see the likelihood of purchasing an energy-efficient light bulb. And if you look at that gray line is kind of flat across ideology, meaning liberals are not significantly more likely than conservatives to purchase an energy-efficient light bulb. Until, and this is the green line, you put an environmental label on it. You actually say this is good for the environment. And all of a sudden, simply by adding that word or that imagery, liberals realize that this is part of my tribe. This is what I stand for. I'd like to protect the environment. And they're more likely to purchase this light bulb. And in the conservative end, I've signaled to them that this is not for them because the environment is an Al Gore type leftover issue for the Democrats, and they're less likely to purchase this. So in other words, simply by not paying attention to the kinds of language that I use to describe what hopefully we'll all agree is a pretty useful technology, meaning energy efficient light bulbs, I can completely split the public in terms of their willingness to use this technology and to use the applications. Problem being simply a function of language, because in the neutral condition without the environmental language, there was absolutely no difference. Second, also related to language, the way we frame decisions. We know, and we gave a Nobel Prize in 2002 to Daniel Kahneman on his work on prospect theory. We know that we can take the exact same fact and describe it in different ways and connect it to different mental schemas, and it will lead to very different interpretations. And we spent the last 2 years talking about COVID, for instance, as a public health issue, and how many people are dying, and how that compares to wars, and how that compares to 9/11. And we basically loss framed it. So if you use the gains loss framing idea that Kahneman and others started. What we didn't do is, for example, to offer a frame that would say, if you're conservative and you're really mostly concerned about the economy, and Rand Paul this morning in the Senate kept just talking about this again and again and again, it actually is in your interest to invest in adaptation and mitigation for, or mitigation, hopefully, and at some point adaptation for COVID. Why? Because it has a real economic value to it. The later economy open up, supply lines open up, the more losses we're going to take, the more we have to invest in various types of mitigation measures, the higher inflation is going to be, and so on. And the Economist had a great piece where they showed that one day of one person not wearing a mask costs us $56 in GDP loss, and you can easily scale that up if you're conservative. So second one is, can we frame information in ways that is palatable, that is consistent with priors, that policymakers, either on the left or the right, depending on what the issue, will see as relevant to their decision making. The third one, and this is really more inward facing, has something to do with how we present scientific evidence. This goes back to my my earlier comment about information being fluid during COVID, and us correcting information with misinformation with science that itself turned out to be wrong. So here the issue is that what we said is basically, well, this is the best available science, and while knowing that the best available science was very temporary. And we actually making that, I would argue we make this value proposition all the time, and I put chemotherapy here as an example, because we still use chemotherapy as a treatment for some cancers, in spite of it being a pretty crude treatment, in terms of crude as in imprecise. We're basically trying to poison the cancer and hope that the cancer dies before the poison affects the body in adverse ways, or and we're making that value proposition knowing that we're working on gold nanoshells, knowing that we're working on personalized medicine, knowing that we're working on targeted drug delivery and are making huge progress. And we're still offering something that we know we will not be using 5 or 10 years from now. In fact, we're not using it for certain types of cancer anymore already. So we're constantly making this value proposition about the best available science right now. We didn't do it during COVID, and I think we're paying a price for it now. And the Laura Ingraham tweet that I showed you was a really good example. The last thing is an interesting one because it has ethical questions connected to it. And this is our department chair, Dominique Bressard, speaking to JAMA and basically saying, well, some of the biases that I just talked to you about and that many of you know, actually become also really powerful mechanisms for getting people to change behaviors. We know, for example, that people don't put solar panels on their roof primarily because they all of a sudden realized that green energy is good, or that it may be cheaper, or that there's a community value to it. One of the strongest predictors of people putting solar panels on their roof is if their neighbor has done it. So in other words, there is a social contagion effect of solar growing along streets and then basically infecting, this is a bad metaphor, but basically infecting the next house. So if we know that social contagion happens, can we use that to for example, encourage pro-environmental behavior? And she was drawing on a piece that they wrote for the National Academies with Robert Cialdini, who of course many of you know because he's one of the fathers of social norms campaigns, kind of how industry and environmental groups can get buy-in to behaviors and nudging behaviors that people otherwise wouldn't necessarily buy into. So I've gone a little bit longer than I've wanted to, it seems, but I'm going to leave it at that with one quick plug, or not plug, but rather since I don't have a piece in this, I just helped edit it. This is a great collection of articles. I can say it since I didn't contribute, on misinformation broadly construed, everything from overviews on literacy to pieces on how science itself, by hyping, by producing retracted science, maybe contributing to a misinformation problem, to some of the backfire effects work that I talked about. It's a really nice collection, a special issue of PNAS that's all public access. So would encourage you to look at it as far as summarizing the current state of the science on this topic. It's probably as good as it gets, simply given the lineup of authors. So with that, I'm going to unshare so I can see you guys a little bit more, and would love to get ideas, pushback, questions, anything. Looking forward to it. Thank you so much again for having me.
Thank you so much for engaging an exciting talk, Dietram. Let's open the floor for discussion, and if it's okay with everybody, let's take a few questions from our live audience, and then we can turn to the Q&A in Zoom. Any questions? And if you would like to ask a question, you can simply stand up. There are microphones listening all above you.
May or may not comfort you.
Exactly. Charles, questions? Yes, Scott.
So I don't know how clearly I'm going to come through. I'll stand over here. So I think maybe the mics are kind of in the middle. So, but I'm just wondering about the idea that the ones, because I'm curious about the fact that in the context of whether it's climate change or COVID-19, there's a kind of an appeal, like it seems like for, maybe for the last few decades in the context of, I teach courses in philosophy of science, for example, and I noticed that in a lot, there's been, I think, a developing, more sophisticated understanding of science, of its social embeddedness, and I think that's kind of affected the way, or at least we could say that up to a point it affected the way we talked about science and about scientific facts. And it seems like in the last number of years, because of these historical events, because of these developments, we've actually fallen back on a kind of naive way of talking about scientific facts and objectivity, as though you could just say, well, we're just, the facts are going to somehow solve our social problems and our, as though those facts were themselves socially neutral, and in fact, like people, we might say like politically kind of liberals, like people that might have been invested in a more sophisticated understanding of science at one point have now sort of become very kind of reactionary in a certain sense in the way we talk about science now. I think and so, but I wonder whether more education about science and about the social processes by which we constitute fact claims in the sciences, like, is there any evidence that helps to address the issue, like in your points there, that of things we could do differently, where we could say, well, the science, this is the science, the best science we have now, for example. Is there evidence that educating people a little more about how science actually works, that it isn't about these sort of clean, apolitical, neutral facts, but is this complicated social process? Does that affect some of these this kind of tribal, epistemology sort of problem, that, or is there any evidence of that?
Yeah. So let me start by wholeheartedly agreeing with you on I think what we've seen within the scientific community, where there may have been a bit more, let's say in the 90s, certainly appreciation for the complexities surrounding how scientific knowledge is constructed, how inextricably linked science, politics, and so on are, even in the creation, as you say, of science, how we prioritize funding, but even within academia, and so on and so forth, and how outdated at the time. I think there's a pretty clear consensus that also led into the early 2000s, even CEOs of AAAS saying this knowledge deficit model is dead. This idea that if we just put facts in front of people, they'll make good decisions, and they just need to follow the science. And I would also, and maybe I'm overstating what you said, but and maybe that is my motivated reasoning, but what I heard you say is also that we're coming back to some of that naivete. And I would actually argue that a lot of the discussions we're having about misinformation are just repackaged deficit thinking. The deficit thinking in the 80s and 90s said, if people only had better information, then they would make decisions that are more in line with the best available science. And so good science communication is getting the facts out. Now we're having this conversation that says, if people had just the correct facts, that's the only variant on that theme, then they would make decisions that are more in line with science. So we need to make sure that people have the correct facts, ignoring a lot of the complexities and systemic problems that I talked about. Then to your question on literacy, and I first thought you were going also education within academia, because I do actually think that's where one of our big deficits are. We, for example, don't require a philosophy of science course anymore. When I did my undergrad in Germany, that was a requirement. We in our grad program don't require a philosophy of science course, sociology of science course. A lot of our students do it because they do an STS minor, but we don't certainly require that in STEM fields. I think that's a really important way of rethinking STEM education. We at Wisconsin also offer PhD minors that hopefully encourage students to cut across fields. And what we're seeing, we have a PhD minor in science communication that a lot of STEM majors or STEM PhDs end up taking, but we have a bit of a selection problem, meaning the STEM PhDs, biophysics, microbial science, engineering, civil engineering, who end up taking our minor are already pretty attuned to the problems that you're describing. So that's why they're selecting into the minor. So we're getting a really good group, but we're getting a group that's predisposed to the ideas. The question is that then your real question is at the audience and at the public or different publics end of things. And I'm not sure that there's very clear evidence that epistemic knowledge of how science works is woefully low. And that's just the technical stuff. That's just knowing how an experiment works and how a scientific study works. That's not even getting at the complexities of how knowledge is socially constructed. And I just don't know if there may well be systematic evidence. I just don't know of that body of literature if it exists. But my hope would be that it exists and that it finds that, yes, this makes a difference. The one area that makes me a bit more pessimistic or maybe realistic is we know that for 330 million Americans, science is not the most important thing in their life. If there was a Maslow kind of attention pyramid, it wouldn't be high up there, because I want to know that my iPhone works. I don't want to know how it was made. At least the vast majority of Americans don't care. And so to which degree that mechanism would, I think your interpretation deserves to be true. I just don't know if it is. But that's because I don't know the data as well. So that was a lengthy and then at the end evasive answer to your question.
think there have always been bad actors, but the thing that seems sort of absent in your talk is that fact and the extent to which it's accelerated today. So I would say, you know, the Laura Ingraham example that you gave suggests that she doesn't know that we're talking about the best available science we have now, that science changes. I think she does know that. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about whether you think this is really a significant factor, or if you really think in the larger picture of things, it's quite small.
Yeah.
Maybe we need to be able to pay attention to people who are, bad actors of propaganda, I guess, right? And how do we detect that?
Yeah. And so I totally agree. So there's a couple of things. One is, when I said earlier, these algorithmic news environments, it's both about the creation of this work, and I think this is already where some of the bad actors come in terms of deep fakes and other things. And what we saw from representative from Texas and his AOC video, that was not even sophisticated, right? That was just malicious or mean-spirited, whatever I mean you want to say. But there's bad actors in creation, there's bad actors in distribution, there's bad actors in amplification. So not necessarily originally distributing, but then giving it legs. And I think Trump would have sometimes claimed that for himself. I just retweeted that. I wasn't the person who did it. And then bad actors in targeting and micro-targeting audiences. And we saw that certainly during the Clinton-Trump election, where Trump supporters were targeted by bad actors, and these were both state and non-state actors, to create discord and basically do on the ground damage to public trust and so on and so forth. So I think it's actually in all four stages, and I think you're totally right. I also agree with you, and I think, and I didn't talk about this in this talk, but it probably deserves its own talk. And I think very often we come up with Republican examples because they've been a bit more extreme recently, and well, a bit more maybe an understatement, but they've been more extreme recently on some issues, and that certainly includes. And I would agree with you that Laura Ingraham is fully aware of how certain or uncertain the science is. I also think that Donald Trump, and I may be alone in that interpretation, but I think Donald Trump is fully convinced that climate change is real, as was George Bush, as are most conservatives. They're just not willing to live with what that might mean and what policy advantage that may give some other parties. On the flip side, and again, I don't mean to create false equivalency here, because I don't think it is perfectly equal or perfectly equivalent. But some of the Green New Deal predictions about where climate is going to be are equally exaggerations of where the science really is, and overstatements in order to promote a certain urgency. And again, not making that as a false equivalency statement here. So I think that is, yes, absolutely has for a long time been a phenomenon. And this also is where I think the statement from 1843 comes in. I think Bush 43, for instance, knew that climate change was real. He was just careful in terms of how to package that and what policy conclusions would be drawn from that, especially after having lost the election to Al Gore, who then went on to win a Grammy and an Oscar and a Nobel Prize for his work in climate. But since the advent of really and prominence, rise to prominence of social media, I think that ability to amplify for strategic purposes misinformation by bad actors or strategic actors, I think has become much more of a problem. I also think, this is to your question, I think this is what was super interesting for me for the last 2 weeks of the Trump presidency, after he had been deplatformed. This was what news coverage should have looked like if journalists had done their job for his whole presidency. What ended up happening is that for most of his presidency, journalists followed Donald Trump's tweets like Pee-wee soccer players follow the ball, right? They didn't play position, they didn't play defense, they didn't play offense, they didn't think about what the whole playing field looked like. They all went after the ball every time he kicked it somewhere. And that makes it really easy for bad actors to amplify certain kinds of messages, because even if everybody just mocks it, it still gets a lot of free media. And I think those last 2 weeks for me were just extremely eye-opening, because all of a sudden journalists had to go back to covering Donald Trump the way they would normally cover him. And that is, what is he doing? What is he saying at press conferences? What are we hearing from the people surrounding him? And what does that mean in a larger context? So it'll be interesting to see what happens when Twitter maybe revisits that ban, or when the next iteration of a Donald Trump on either side of the party shows up. But I think the bad actor one is a really important one. It's also one that in the Academy's Committee on Misleading Information, that's one that we're really looking into very carefully, because I think it's a really important one.
Thank you. Other questions from the audience in this room?
And maybe while you're thinking of questions, I can quickly speak to Steve's in the chat, because I think it's right that that there's on average that there's a little bit of a dip in the middle, and among independents that also goes down, and there might well be a little bit, given when the study was done, of a confound of how high quality the environmentally friendly light bulbs were perceived to be. So that label may be both ideological, which clearly it showed, but also just a cue for quality. So I think that's a very good observation.
We have a few questions in the chat.
Oops, I just saw one, sorry.
Oh, are there any others? Just the one. It's just the one in the chat. Any other questions before we say goodbye? Dr. Scheufele? Last call on Zoom?
I don't know if Steve wants to follow up on his question live or not. I'm happy to, of course, or. Oh, okay.
One moment. We're trying to unmute you, Steve.
There we go. Got it. Can you hear me?
Yes, we
Yeah,
can.
I can.
Yes.
Great. Thank you very much. Great talk. Sorry I couldn't be there in person. Just to follow up sort of this idea of with the labeling graph of how people might have been choosing, does that also suggest a messaging strategy of, and this is a standard political messaging strategy, is if they're attacking you on topic A, you focus on topic B. And so, and maybe it's a science, non-science, or science that's questionable and not science, or non-questionable science, or non-controversial science. Should we be sort of dodging the things that we know are going to set off the two sides, whichever sides those may be?
I think that's one strategy, but I think the other strategy, and this is where we as in science have been not very good at, is actually offering competing or a better way of framing and rethinking of how to describe this in ways that may be more palatable across the aisle. We're doing a project right now funded by the Templeton Foundation with Bob Inglis, and some of you will know his name. He had a short segment in The Merchants of Doubt when that book was turned into a documentary. He's a former congressman from South Carolina who runs an organization called Republican, with a capital EN at the end, trying to engage Republicans on climate. And he lost his reelection primary to a Tea Party candidate when he started embracing climate change as a Republican in South Carolina. And since then, he devoted his life to basically figuring out how can we better message to conservatives about science that affects their lives and that they shouldn't reject simply for political reasons. And he and I have had a lot of conversations about the question of how do we, what has happened with describing issues in ways, and you know, you were saying maybe we shouldn't just touch it because it ends up polarizing. And I think for some issues that's absolutely the right strategy. But I think for others, we're not even trying to package issues in ways that would be palatable to let's say a more conservative audience, or on the flip side to a more religious audience, when it comes to stem cell research and so on and so forth. And I think this is where the inability or the reluctance of the academic community to think about how we talk about issues has been absolutely detrimental. So Greenpeace, let's take an attack from the left. Greenpeace routinely says that GMOs are not safe for human consumption, genetically modified organisms. We know from National Academy's consensus studies, 1,600 peer-reviewed articles, that there's no difference in terms of health effects between traditionally grown crops and genetically modified crops. Nonetheless, Greenpeace calls it frankenfood and we're done, right? Because by calling it by framing it as frankenfood, what I've done is I've connected a technology that I don't understand as a normal consumer. I don't know how GMOs work. I don't know how CRISPR works, but I know Frankenstein, and I know that they put stuff together that doesn't belong together. Dr. Frankenstein did, that the monster got out of the lab, and it was really hard to eventually bring it back in. And all of it happened because of scientific hubris. So by simply using one frame, I've opened a whole storyline that allows me as a consumer to easily interpret why this is bad for me. And our counter has been, well, there's golden rice, so that's really good for vitamin A deficiencies in other countries. And we could feed the world, and it really helps farmers and Monsanto. That has been our counterframe. And so I think we just haven't made really good value propositions around science that says, this is why this actually works for both sides of the political aisle. This is why climate is a military issue. This is why climate is an economic issue. We know that Coca-Cola has long invested in climate change adjustments to their production process because of how much water they need for producing each can of soda. We know that Nike has for a long time invested in cotton alternatives because they know that water shortages are coming. We know that the Coast Guard is really concerned about this. So how have we not been able to manage this, to communicate this? And partly it is because, of course, we use it as an issue to mobilize our ultra-liberal base to turn out in elections, because that's really exciting, especially in coastal areas. But it's much less productive when it comes to building messaging that cuts across the aisle. But I do think that the academic community carries a good bit of the blame here, because we just don't think that the way we talk about technologies actually matters. And unfortunately, or fortunately, it does. And everybody else has figured it out. And not framing is simply not an option, because each new technology will be surrounded by certain language. I think one of the most striking examples, and I'm in a College of Ag and Life Sciences, so I have a lot of appreciation for production ag, but when they came out with what was publicly or colloquially known as pink slime, or lean finely textured beef, as I think that was what the meat industry called it. Of course, pink slime was everywhere, and eventually the meat industry sued ABC News over the use of the term and tried to stop them from using the term, which then led to Stephen Colbert to devote a whole show of the Colbert Show at the time on Comedy Central just to the term pink slime, just to hammer home the point of how important language is and how dangerous it is if we don't find labels or ways of describing. And I'm not endorsing finely textured beef necessarily as a product, but let's assume it is a product that we really do think will do good in the world. Figuring out ways to talk about it that doesn't polarize, I think, is crucially important. And I agree with you, sometimes that may mean simply not talking about it. I feel like I'm giving really long-ish academic answers, which is painful. My apologies for that.
No, thank you. Any other questions? Well, I would like to join me in thanking Dr. Scheufele for the wonderful.
Thank you again for having me.